The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Well, hello to all our weirdos and weirdettes, and welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dean Bertram, and joining me is the always magnificent Jenn Durrell. How are you tonight, baby?
I'm doing pretty darn good. How about you?
I'm super excited because of tonight's guest, one of my all-time faves.
Yes. Yes.
Has come back, which is good. I had a busy day today, though. Fall is really dropping here, so I had to get the last of my potatoes out of the ground because we're getting frost after frost after frost. So I was out there digging them out with my little girl today, my daughter. We were at a Halloween event yesterday, and I'm like, why am I so sore today? I'm like, I haven't worked out in ages. And then I realized I was carrying this monster pumpkin. Even though we grow our own, I wanted to give some money to the event we went to. And so I bought, a pumpkin probably half the size of me, and I had to carry it, I don't know, half a mile back to the truck or something. I'm like, did I work out yesterday? I haven't worked out in months. And I'm like, okay, I was carrying that pumpkin.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like fun, though. Yeah. Well,
you've set up your you've done your Halloween decorations.
Well, some of it. I still haven't had time to get most of it done, but some of it. But we have fall here as well. So Missouri finally got around 30 degrees, or at least central Missouri, last night for the first time. So fall has arrived.
It feels like it's the spooky season now. It looks like the spooky season up here, which is great. Mm-hmm. So, one other thing I should say before we introduce tonight's amazing guest is I'd love it if people wanted to leave us a report of their own, particularly if it's related to something they saw on the show. But even if it's not, if you'd like to record a message for us here at Talking Weird, you can go to untolradioam.com, just scroll down beyond or below all the little show icons, and you can just literally hit record and record a voice message. And then when you're prompted to send it, you can just say which one of the many shows that are on the network you want to address it to. So record us a show, make it maybe under a minute or so. Tell us if you have a wonderful experience or a spooky experience, particularly this time of the year, you'd like to share. Love to hear it. Love to start playing some of those at the beginning of each episode. You're nodding in agreement, Jenn?
Yes, I very much agree.
It would be great.
That would be cool.
Yeah, it'd be fantastic. Anyway, without you and me chitter-chattering back and forth, let's get straight into it because, like I said, I'm so excited about tonight's guest. He's a native Texan known for his work in writing, music, and film. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Beast of Boggy Creek and Sinister Swamps, whose subject matter reflects his lifelong fascination with legendary creatures and strange phenomena. He is also the founder of the rock band Ghoultown and narrator-producer of documentary films such as The Mothman of Point Pleasant and Boggy Creek Monster. Tonight, among other things, we'll be talking about his latest book, which is this one here, TEXAS BIGFOOT, History, Legends, and Modern Encounters in the Lone Star State. I just got it last week and I've read it and I love it. I love all things Texas and all things Bigfoot, so it was a match made in heaven for me. Anyway, I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird one of our all-time favorite guests, the one and only Lyle Blackburn.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming back.
Mm-hmm.
It's so good to have you. I mentioned briefly before the show how much my daughter is such a fan of Lyle Blackburn's and Ken Gerhardt's and Doug Hychek's. I have to tell you a funny story. She was going to come and say hello, but she fell asleep, so she's going to be so devastated in the morning that she missed you. But as I was mentioning before, I have a little garden here. I have pumpkins and potatoes and the like. And about a month or so ago, my daughter was insistent that she saw some strange black creature run into our pumpkin patch. And I mean, she's at that age where she's in the imaginal world. So she has one foot in our world, 1 foot in the land of the imagination. I'm sure you probably are aware of what that's like with little kids too, Lyle. But she was very insistent. This wasn't one of her imaginary dragons, or she has all these other critters that she engages in. And she says, "You've got to ask Lyle Blackburn or Ken Gerhard or Doug Hycheck, because one of them are going to know." So,
well, it was obviously Pumpkinhead. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be my initial assessment of the case without having, come there and done field research. But yeah, I'll tell her it could have been Pumpkinhead, and she's probably safe because I'm sure she's a good girl, and I think he only goes for bad guys and stuff, so it's all good.
I will tell her that. In fact, I'll play this for her tomorrow when she awakes and is devastated that she missed you. I love Texas Bigfoot. I mean, it was such a great book. I'm a big fan of all of your writings, and one of the things I found endearing in it is that you talk about how you used to hunt with your dad, bow hunt in Texas, and you were a kid who was interested in Bigfoot and all of these other type things, but you never really associated Bigfoot with Texas. And we'll get to that a little bit in a minute, I think, the history of it. But you hunted in an area that you didn't know, but it was kind of a Bigfoot hotspot. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I think that's a fun tale.
Right. I think I might not have wanted to go with my dad hunting if I'd have known that Bigfoot was out there, because he would, he was kind of a hunter since he was a kid. So he'd just sometimes just leave me out there, or I'll be back. And, I can remember being pretty scared a lot of times, trial by fire. But we hunted in an area of central Texas along the Brazos River, in an area called Possum Kingdom, and there's a state park and a lake out there, and a lot of areas where people hunt. And it's kind of an area that you wouldn't think is very squatchy, so to speak. I mean, there's different parts of Texas, and people kind of have that idea that all of Texas is sort of like ranches and John Wayne movie. But we do have a wide range from deserts all the way to the thick piney woods of the east, and this is kind of in the central. Mesquite trees, clumps of trees, some waterways, but not heavily thicketed. And so at the time I was very young, I still wasn't aware that there were Bigfoot sightings in Texas. All I knew of was sort of the traditional Pacific Northwest stories and things like that, which I was exposed to first and early on. So, I was never looking for Bigfoot. We were looking for deer or turkey, and that was it. But as I did research, and, as in my adult life, especially as I paid attention to these reports, and being from Texas, having grown up in Fort Worth, I became aware that there had been sightings out in this area. And then when I was doing the Texas Bigfoot book, I was able to kind of put that all together and really, write about it as a whole, and kind of put myself in it, not from the perspective of I saw a Bigfoot or anything, but I had been in those woods, and I had no idea that I was that close to an area that had some great stories.
Yeah, I think that's something people who've never been to Texas don't realize about that state. I mean, I love the state of Texas. I have family there, but I'd never visited there until 1999. And I flew into Houston, and I'd grown up on cowboy movies and the Alamo and stuff like that. And when I flew into Houston, there's all this forest all around. I'm like, what on earth? This was nothing like what I imagined. So you make the point actually in the book of saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's more, other than Alaska, there's more like square miles of forest in Texas than in any other state in the Union. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, because it's such a huge state, so that even though not all of it is heavily forested, when you put it all together, especially that eastern third of the piney woods, forestry wise, it is just massive, and there's thickets and even swampy areas. So people, like you say, you fly into Houston, which is essentially in the southern portion of the piney woods. You like, and I remember that when I was a kid, we had family in East Texas in the far end. The first time I remember driving out there, and the landscape began to change, and there was tall trees and just shadowy woods. And I was like, this is a totally different vibe. And I loved doing it because it was very scenic, and it was a lot different from the central portions of Texas where I was from. So in retrospect, you can imagine why there was Bigfoot sightings out there, because it's just thickets.
Hmm. And it also the book also, which I enjoyed, ties in a lot to your other research in like the Falcon Monster, the Beast of Boggy Creek, insofar as that the Red River is the Sulphur River flows from Boggy Creek, flows into the Sulphur River, I think, and then the Sulphur River flows into the Red River, and then the Red River has all these Bigfoot sightings around it as well. So there's almost a corridor where you could imagine the Falcon Monster itself almost traveling down into Texas, as you always make the point of saying they travel the creeks or something, right?
Right. Yeah, it's very good. You know your geography there, because it's one of those things where these cases seem isolated, but as you start looking at the geography, you realize that there is some patterns to this. And I don't think I've ever, in any book I've written, I've never not mentioned the legend of Boggy Creek, because not only have I researched that area and all that, but the guy saw my.
I'm sorry, I had to put that up. Yeah, Mothman 46 said he saw something that looked like you at I'm sure it was Lyle at the Mothman Festival. I'm guessing. Yeah.
But in the Legend of Boggy Creek movie that dramatized the sightings of the creature in southern Arkansas, they talked about the Sulphur River flows, and it was in the songs and everything. Well, that Sulphur River starts in Texas, and like you said, runs down through Boggy Creek, feeds into it, and not coincidentally, when you start kind of going out and looking at this Sulphur River corridor, boom, you find sightings over the years. And then as it flows down in the Red River and hooks into that, you just see all these patterns, which tend to make sense because they are areas where I guess one could imagine a creature like this being able to move about in relative seclusion.
What are some areas in Texas that you were surprised to find these things in? Because I know in the book there's a number of cases where I was like, wow, there were Bigfoot seen here as well.
Well, I was surprised by at least the amount of credible encounters that had come out of places like the Panhandle, which, the top portion of Texas, and that is very wide open. I mean, it's scrublands and wide open areas moving up towards the plains and cattle drive kind of places. And there was some very dramatic sightings that were, researched by various colleagues or other folks or covered in newspapers. And, in one case, there was 3 guys riding motorcycles through there in the Panhandle, and something ran out in the road, and the first guy just kind of barely saw it. The second guy had to swerve, and the third guy almost hit it. So you had 3 guys who nearly hit this thing, but it's just in this wide open area. And I was pretty surprised that there was even any encounters, but this wasn't just, just some person just randomly telling a story. This is 3 witnesses, so it had some credibility, and that was surprising. And then, of course, there were a number of cool cases out in the more western portion of Texas. Not as many, but there were more than I thought. Enough to where at first I kind of was going to lump the whole, practically the western half, into one chapter. Well, I had to break it into 2 because there was more than I thought, and very interesting stories that add a lot of flavor to the book, I think.
Yeah, I would just bring up a comment from a viewer at the moment, because you talk about this whole chapter on Caddo Lake, I think, in the book. Chuck Jr. says Caddo Lake, Texas is a hot spot. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of sections to that area, in particular Caddo Lake, and I mean, I've written about that in quite a few of my books, and I've spent a lot of time out there in that area. And that's right on the border of Texas and Louisiana. Caddo Lake is super swampy. I mean, it looks like a primordial swamp. You wouldn't imagine just seeing a Bigfoot, but you might imagine seeing some sort of a prehistoric dinosaur or something. It's got that vibe, and a long history of quite credible Bigfoot sightings.
And I think you mentioned in the book too, one of those knockoff Boggy Creek Monster knockoff movies, or Legend of Boggy Creek knockoffs, was shot in Caddo Lake, right? I think.
Yeah, Caddo Lake, and it's been used in quite a few movies actually. And that let's see, Boggy Creek, The Legend is True. I think 2010. People thought it was going to be a remake, but it wasn't. It was just kind of glomming onto the name for recognition. But they shot that in Caddo, and there's another kind of indie Bigfoot movie called Skookum that was shot out there. And over the years, other kinds of movies had been shot out there because it's just, like I said, so scenic.
We mentioned your book. I do a show on Tuesday night, also on Untold Radio Network with Jason McLean called Mysterious Library. And we do, hot off the presses as well as the main book. And of course, I know that Jason is a colleague and a friend of yours. So we of course mentioned when your book had dropped, we were quite excited about it. But I think it might have been the same show that we did as the main book. Because we tend to do classics and older books for the most part. We will, and as Jason said, we have to get around to actually doing Texas Bigfoot at some time. In fact, we need to get you on the show to deconstruct another book which isn't yours. We thought that would be fun. Get a classic book you like, and the three of us deconstruct it. But that's for another time. But what I was getting to is, I think we did Peter Burns' The Search for Bigfoot when we did yours as the hot off the presses book, and I find it interesting reading a book from that vintage by one of the leading Bigfooters then to one of the leading researchers in the field today, you, and seeing how much this field seems to have changed. Like in The Search for Bigfoot, Peter seems to suggest that they're only in the Pacific Northwest. Like there's this band of, territory which he talks about, and that's it. He doesn't really look anywhere else. But secondly, I was very conscious when I read that, because I hadn't read it for, years, how in that book, Peter seems to suggest really there, or at least only mention, because he talks about them at various times, the three, what seemed to be the main cryptids everybody was interested. One was Bigfoot, obviously, because that's the title of the book. The other was the Yeti, not surprisingly, because it's really a cousin of Bigfoot, essentially, or that's the way most people think of it. And the other was the Loch Ness Monster. But it seems today, and when I think of In Search Of and shows like that in the 70s, which I know both you and I grew up on, they seem to be the monsters that were talked about. But today, cryptozoology seems to have so many other things which weren't even considered back then. And we'll get to your wonderful podcast, Monstro Bizarro, and this might be a good segue into that as well, even though I want to talk more about Texas Bigfoot. But there's so many creatures that you look at in that and you have in your career. Do you think that the cryptozoological field is becoming too broad, or do you think it's a good thing that it looks at all these various entities now?
No, I think it's great. I mean, I think we've become aware of a lot more stories of, these sort of unexplained creatures than initially were known, or at least known widely back in those days, because and my first exposure to this was a book called Strange But True, I think in third grade, and it had the big three. It was just Bigfoot, Yeti, Loch Ness Monster, and that's why I didn't realize Bigfoot was in Texas, because it talked about Bigfoot lives in the Pacific Northwest. You got the Yeti over there. I thought, well, there you go. But I think over the years, and now a book like Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us by John Green, which was written in the 70s, it did include like all these other states. So, but someone would have had to have gotten that book at that particular time to realize, okay, well, but even in that, necessarily it was Sasquatch, but a lot of times these stories of hairy bipedal creatures in the South were always kind of monsterized or looked at as somebody saw this weird ape or a swamp monster, not necessarily tied into Bigfoot. Like we kind of have this idea now, like sort of a Finding Bigfoot view of it all, where you go to any state, there's sightings of Bigfoot. It's, I don't care what you call it, the Falcon Monster, the Caddo creature, or whatever, it's basically Bigfoot. But at those early times, that's sort of what was known. But now we've got the internet. We've got many, many more books written. We got many more researchers that have added to the story, that now we've become aware of everything from, of course, chupacabra to obscure lake monsters, White River monster, to bigger lake monsters like Champ, and then just little bitty old things like Dover Demon, and just a variety of the night crawlers and all this that may only have one or two sightings, but they're kind of included in this, iconic cryptids.
Well, I'll segue into a viewer's question with that. Mothman 46 said Lyle's teammates, Small Town Monsters, were in his neighborhood filming a Texas terror dog movie. Does Lyle have any Dogman sightings and reports? I know that you have many Dogman sightings and reports because you just did a Monstro Bizarro where you did a Southern Werewolf episode not more than a month or so ago.
Right. Well, surely. I mean, I've been told of encounters and interviewed people, and I personally know I've some pretty good friends that have had encounters, or they had encounters when they were younger. I've never seen a dog man, although I had a kind of a strange experience when I was younger of something I didn't quite see with this heavy growl and sort of a situation where maybe in retrospect, I'm like, well, maybe it was a dog man, but
that's in the graveyard. Can you tell us that story? That's a cool story.
Yeah, and I did include that on my podcast. Back when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend her parents had a lake house out at Lake Tyler, and Tyler is in the piney woods, very heavily forested area, and I was always into every kind of unsolved mystery and monsters and whatever. So at the time I was kind of into ghosts, and there was these old graveyards we would pass because we would go down there late. You'd pass these graveyards that were very small. I'm like, we should go into some of those and like bring a cassette recorder and record, put it on the grave, or I'd seen this stuff on shows and thought of these ideas. So we went into this one, and we have been into several, and I wasn't particularly scared. I grew up hunting since I was a kid. I didn't care. I didn't have a flashlight. I didn't care. I just went in the woods. I went in this particular cemetery, and it was a small one, and it was chain link fenced in. And we went in there, and we're just kind of walking around, just assessing the graves, see how old the markers are and stuff. And I think there was enough moonlight to see. I didn't have a flashlight, and I kind of went to the very far back of the graveyard because, again, I'm Mr. Brave, and she was back kind of at the start of it. It wasn't that big. I go over there, and I hear something moving outside the chain link fence in the trees, and I kind of got quiet, and I listened, and whatever it was just made this sort of a deep grunting growl type noise. And I don't know what it was. I mean, at the time there wasn't a lot of hogs. There was pretty much no hogs down there back then. And it didn't sound like a snort or a hog. It didn't sound like, I wouldn't say it was a bear. From what experience I had with bears at the time, and it wasn't a snort of a deer. It did not sound like a small canid, like maybe a coyote. Whatever it was freaking huge. And that's the only time I literally just turned around and ran. It scared me, and I told her, I go, get in the truck and let's go. And we jumped in and said, what? I go, I heard something. It's over the fence. It's back in those woods. I don't know what it was, and I'm not going to find out. We left. The only time I ever ran out of the woods.
That's like a scene from a horror movie. Fantastic.
So, but to finalize that question, yes, I have talked to witnesses and people, even in Texas, that have had Dogman sightings. And of course, when the Small Town Monsters crew was here, I did an interview I did an actual sit-down interview for that movie, whereas normally I'm either the narrator or I'm in the movie. This is the first time they had just sort of had me sit down, and I just added my thoughts to this phenomenon.
I love it when you're involved in the Small Town Monster movies. That was my introduction to you. Two things, I think. Jen and I run a film fest called Midwest Weird Fest in Eau Claire, and in the very first year, the first year of our festival, Seth submitted the Boggy Creek Monster Small Town Monsters doco, and at the same time, like, it was just a coincidence. Around the same time, I bought your Monstro Bizarro book come magazine that you'd written for for Rue Morgue or as part of the Rue Morgue imprint. So it was like this double dosage of Lyle Blackburn, because I'd been out of the field for a little while. I hadn't really been paying attention to anything. And I was like, wow, this guy's super cool. So it was a joy. It's always a joy to have you on. What we're talking about, your fantastic podcast, it's really great. The stories you tell on Monster Bizarro are just great. Anybody who loves this type of material should go and check that out. And where is that? Just quick, we'll get you to say it at the end of the show as well. But where do people check out Monster Bizarro if they want to listen to it?
It's on all those major podcast platforms, Apple and Spotify and Amazon. But if you go to my website, there's kind of some info and links there to where you can get it. It's even on YouTube. Put them up there. So.
Okay, awesome. And we'll get you to share some links at the end as well. But the Southern Werewolves one, I was particularly interested. I don't know if you recall, I mean, I'm writing a couple books, but it's taking forever to do this book, which includes cryptid kind of attack stories. And you were very gracious and very helpful when I asked you some questions for that book. You sent me a bunch of stuff. And I was like, wow, this Lyle guy's a super sweet guy, because you didn't really know me from Adam when you sent me that stuff. But there was a case when I was looking at Wolfman or Dogman or werewolf attacks on houses, which was the Vidor, Texas case from 1978, which you include in that Southern Werewolves Monster Bizarro episode. And to me, it rings very true, because there are things in a lot of dogmen attacking houses stories which are similar, weirdly similar. Like they often scratch apart screen doors and screen windows, which is just like, it's weird. Like, surely they could do more than scratch these windows. But there's report after report after report I've heard of dogmen scratching windows. But what is fascinating, and what made me think about it when I was researching that case, was another book that you wrote. And that's in one of your Boggy Creek books. You mention as an aside, and you say, I don't think this is the case, but it's worth mentioning, that Falk, Arkansas was a sundown town. In other words, it was an area which had a reputation that black people weren't welcome there after the sun went down. But fascinatingly, Vidor, Texas is also an infamous sundown town. So I don't think it was a hoax, but to extrapolate from that type of idea, which you mentioned was a theory about the Falcon Monster, that perhaps that Vidor attack could have been a hoax perpetuated to invent this story that the area was unfriendly and there were monsters that would get you after dark. Is that something you've considered about the Vidor case? Or?
No, I mean, I wasn't aware that it had the reputation as a sundown town. But I mean, we're talking like 1978. So I'm kind of thinking that by then it probably wouldn't be something that people would care to do. I mean, there was still integration issues going on then, but it definitely wasn't, something like I would think in the 60s, that's where, and that's kind of, the Falk reputation kind of came from, I think, in a lot of that era in the 60s. And then, but I think once we started getting towards the 80s, you had the extremes groups, but I don't think you had any conscious effort. And I certainly don't think that would have been somebody, well, let's dress up like a werewolf or create the story and that'll keep, some minorities out. Not to say that it couldn't have been a hoax, like somebody messing with that person. But the funny thing is they were the second owners of the house or subsequent owners. So stuff was going on to multiple people. So it wasn't like a family was targeted. Why would they target this particular house? Who knows?
No, I actually agree with you. The only reason I asked you that question was because I'd read in your book when I was around the same time I was writing on the Vidor thing, I read that you made the reference to the history of Falk. So I thought I just bring it up. And again, it has so many elements which are similar to other dogman attacks. I think it fits the pattern. So I also don't think it was hoax. I was just curious. While we're talking dogman though, let's stay on it for a little bit, because dogman seems to be such a popular topic. And then we'll get back to Texas Bigfoot, I promise. Do you, and this is something else Jason McLean and I talked about recently on Untold, on the other Untold radio show I do, Untold Radio Network show I do, Mysterious Library, and that is that kind of prior to Linda Godfrey's coverage of the Bray Road beast or the beast of Bray Road, and prior to the Steve Cook April Fool's Day hoax in Michigan, the DJ who wrote the Dogman song, there weren't a whole lot of, and I'm not saying the reports weren't there, but there weren't a whole lot of Dogman reports. That's why the Vidal case is so interesting. And there were, don't get me wrong, there are definitely some, as you well know, but it seems like there's a period from the late 90s onwards, or the mid 90s onwards, maybe even the late, where the Dogman thing just blew up. Like it just became, people seem to see Dogman as much as they see Bigfoot now. Is that something you've been conscious of, and do you have an explanation for that, or?
Oh, yeah, I'm definitely aware of that because, no one ever said anything about Dogman for years. And then especially in the last 4 years, every single person asked me about Dogman. I mean, it is nonstop. It is the number one question. Hey, what do you think about Dogman? Or do you know anybody that had a sighting? You ever seen a Dogman? None of that existed prior to some years ago, especially, like I said, in the last 4 or 5 years, which is weird because, I mean, either there is a proliferation of these creatures now, or people were completely silent about it all these years, which may be the case, a little bit of both. But I would say there's certain, when people become attuned to the possibility of this, either they're more aware or looking for this stuff. I don't know if that produces sightings, but it's like me in the woods as a kid. I didn't know there was Bigfoot there, so I wasn't looking. I might have walked right past a track. I might have saw something and thought, well, that was a whatever, a deer, a goat, or whatever. I don't know. So it's an interesting social phenomenon, as well as a creature, a potential creature situation. But I've noticed that it is a super hot topic, and suddenly there's just Dogman sighting after Dogman sighting, to where I would imagine going in any woods now, your chances of seeing a Dogman are better than Bigfoot.
Yeah, it's crazy. And do you differentiate while we're on this topic? Like, I know some cryptozoologists will say, well, Bigfoot seems like it could likely be, and one of the great things about the end of your book, it's not really a spoiler because it's obviously something you think about, is that you say, well, there's different interpretations, and you don't say which one you've really totally banked on. Like, is it a relict hominid? Is it a Neanderthal type? That's not the language you use, but a Neanderthal type other human? Is it interdimensional? Is it extraterrestrial? All the type of theories that float around. But I know there's some cryptozoologists who are more comfortable saying, well, Bigfoot looks evolutionarily possible, for lack of a better term. Like, maybe it's a physical creature, and we think Bigfoot might be physically real, but maybe something like Mothman or something like Dogman is paranormal. Like, they make this demarcation. Is that something you find yourself kind of trapped in between, trying to decide, or?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it kind of leads you to those conclusions. I mean, because, a lot of just sort of your average analyzation of this is, yes, Bigfoot makes more biological sense. I mean, it's very human-like. It's something that can fit into our bushy tree of evolution, or however you want to explain it. But certainly, we are basically great apes, and it fits into that. So there's some sense could be made that, okay, this is just something we haven't discovered. When you start to get into bipedal canids, I mean, it makes less biological sense. I mean, even the bone structure of a quadruped, especially a canid, they have narrow hips. Their form is maximized to walk on 4 legs, and that's what they do. They do not get up and walk on 2 legs. Bears will walk on 2 legs more than a dog or a wolf. So it makes less sense sort of in terms of terrestrial biology. So that's why it tends to jump between like, okay, it's just this crazy werewolf creature to a paranormal type thing, because how do you explain this? So, I typically find my role is not somebody who's trying to necessarily prove or disprove one certain thing. I try to be open-minded. And in my books, as you say, I try to point out, here's the case, here's the sightings, here's all the theories that people have proposed. I don't know which one is correct, but I'm going to put them all here for it to be food for thought for any readers who now kind of can understand the scope of it. And I'm the same way with Dogman. I don't think that it's not real. I don't have any proof of it, but it certainly falls into the same category of there are credible people that have seen things that we simply can't explain, and we're still trying to grasp just what those unexplained things are.
Yeah, I think that's the healthiest approach to recognize that there are alternative interpretations the way that you do. Now, before I keep hogging this interview, as I will do, and before I know it, the hour will be up. Jen, do you have some questions for Lyle before I roll back into my extra Texas Bigfoot questions that I have?
Well, I'm very interested in Native American history, and so I know you've definitely had to run across some folklore or Native American stories. So is there any one in particular from that area that kind of caught your attention or you've heard of?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, anytime you're looking at the history of sightings in any particular area of these creatures, I mean, it would make sense that if we see them now, then certainly the indigenous people who lived here before would have had encounters.
Yeah.
So, in the case of tribes specific to this area, especially say Texas, there's the Caddo Indian tribe, for which Caddo Lake was named. And they had stories of sort of a race of what's loosely translated to lost giants, some sort of large, presumably human-like entities that lived in the forest that they shared space with. While they don't necessarily go to describe them as Bigfoot, but we can say, well, perhaps that's what they're referring to. I mean, without using the term Bigfoot. And as you move north in Texas, you're up in Oklahoma, where you play in a lot of Native American folklore, because there's a lot of concentration where they moved a lot of tribes to the reservation. So I've been in Oklahoma a lot and talked to numerous, Native American folks that have all sorts of insights and stories and sightings to add to it. And in particular, right along the Red River that we discussed earlier, some of those tribes that are kind of in that area had talked of a creature that they call a champ. Not sure the exact pronunciation, but essentially described it again as this sort of hairy man-like creature that had a vile odor, which, we got skunk apes, you kind of play in, and they said some were benevolent, some were dangerous, and such as Native American folklore, because a lot of these characters that they would include in their stories, were tricksters or had, could be dangerous. But again, it's just sort of a general kind of a Sasquatch sounding creature that it's hard to decide if it's part of the mythology or if they're literally talking about a flesh and blood creature. But either way, there are stories from Native Americans in this area that describe creatures like that.
Yeah. I had heard some stories before where I don't know what part of America it was in, because I can't really remember, but it was where they would capture the women and just take off with them. And I didn't know if that was something that was down there too, but I always found that fascinating.
Yeah, that's more Pacific Northwest, actually.
Okay.
And I did an episode on my podcast about Bigfoot attacks, and people kind of there's always a reputation that Southern Bigfoots are dangerous and wild, and that kind of comes from the legend of Boggy Creek, because it was there was a lot of attack sort of things. But you look back at those early Pacific Northwest stories and Native American stories, and they talked, about these creatures would kidnap women, kidnap children. Stories like Albert Ostman, where he was dragged away from his camp. So, we're not the only ones down here in the South that have unruly Bigfoot. So, but yeah, that's more from what I know specifically, not specifically, but primarily in the Pacific Northwest.
Okay.
Well, speaking of Texas and Texas Bigfoot, Jason McLean, our mutual friend for Serial Papers, he is here. Just said, sorry, I'm late. It's Jason's birthday today, my co-host on Mysterious Library. So happy birthday, Jason, and thank you for spending some of your birthday evening
happy birthday.
with us.
Happy birthday, buddy.
So here's something I think I think last time we were on, we talked a little bit about this. I tend to lean to a more, I guess, esoteric view of Bigfoot. I think people definitely have experiences, and I don't rule out the entire possibility that there aren't some physical Bigfoot. I mean, to be honest, I don't really even believe that, but I think it's a possibility. I don't doubt people are having these experiences with all kinds of things, Bigfoot, Dogman, so on. But if it's physical, here's my problem. Often somebody will say, well, where's the body? Where's a body? And some other people will say, well, if there was a body, it would break apart in the woods anyway, or maybe the Bigfoot bury their dead or something else. But your book made it quite clear as to why I have a problem with it. And that problem is, it isn't that I need to find a body. I'm amazed that somebody hasn't shot one and delivered one yet, to be honest. And because Texas is a state, I mean, I live in Wisconsin, we've got a lot of guns up here as well, but Texas is famous for amounts of guns. And sure enough, in your book, there's lots of cases of people shooting Bigfoot and hitting Bigfoot, shooting Bigfoot, missing Bigfoot, having a gun and thinking, I won't take the shot because maybe my gun is not powerful enough. But my point is, I do believe if there was some type of hairy, whether it was a relic, hominid, or whether it was something else, a genuine hairy physical, ape type man, I find it difficult to believe that somebody hasn't shot one and dragged it in yet, particularly because there's so many sightings involving guns. Is that something that you've kind of scratched your head over at all, or?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something that it presents a problem, and it's twofold. It's one, the fact that one of these hunters hadn't just gone ahead and shot one, and number two, the fact that there are quite a few reports that people say they shot them and it had no effect, literally no effect. I mean, not even just like it was wounded and it managed to run off, like it did nothing, which is odd. It's like, how do you explain that? So I certainly agree that this just creates a problem on how to explain that. I mean, I can say for sure that a lot of the hunters I've talked to that have had encounters will say that, for a minute I thought about it, but then it just, I didn't want to take a chance. What if it was a dude in a costume? I had to play that in, and I just didn't want to take that risk. I just didn't feel like that was the right thing to do. And I understand that. But, I mean, like my dad, my uncles, and all the guys in my family, like, if I see one, I'm shooting it. I mean, thinking, well, they better not go to my to my uncle's deer lease or whatever, because it's doomsday. But, I don't know. It just falls again in the cracks of it. It just may not make a lot of sense, but credible people have seen these, and maybe it just hasn't lined up just right for somebody to shoot one or bring the body in or whatever it is. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't prove or disprove. It just is another lingering question that just lingers and lingers and lingers.
I wonder if the Native Americans had something to it. I don't know. I only hear the secondhand reports of what they believe, but the idea that it could travel between worlds, it was part of this world and also part of another. And maybe that would explain how some physical evidence gets left behind, like tracks, for example. But then there's never a body left behind or any, evidence which is substantial enough to convince the scientific establishment into believing that this thing's real.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I've noticed that the Native American view of this, moreover than not, is that, yeah, it has some powers that we don't understand, or it travels in a way that, yes, it's between worlds or whatever. Which, the problem is, the longer it goes and we don't have a body, and we don't have proof, that's why I've seen over the last 5-6 years, there are just more extreme theories about Bigfoot that are more paranormal than there were before. But it's literally because we just still don't have that body. And it doesn't mean that it's paranormal, but that I totally understand why we're trying to grasp with what we're given here. We don't have the smoking gun.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, I mean, I think there is, we live in this world where we're talking about Sasquatch sightings, we're looking at them and all this stuff, but in reality, there's not that many. I mean, there's a lot of sightings, but they're spread out. They're in a lot, over a wide area. There doesn't really need to be a lot of these creatures to have a viable population. And I've been hunting and in the woods and stuff, and I've ran across a couple of bears in my time, but never one in Texas. There has been some bears out in the piney woods on occasion, but many times I've been out there, I've never come across one, and I've certainly never come across a dead one. And by sort of an extrapolation, if you theorize that, I mean, if there's 3,000 bears in Texas, for example, there could be 300 Sasquatch. And this is sort of kind of drawing from my colleague, Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who did some more, mathematically correct calculations just to figure out what is the population of Bigfoot. So it would be about, 3,000 to 300, or 30,000 to well, it was even more than that. But the bottom line is, there could be very few of these creatures, which would make it extremely hard to run across one, extremely hard to find a body. There just are not that many, especially if they're actively trying to stay elusive. So in terms of the fact that they're that rare, which I believe they are, I mean, like I said, it seems like Bigfoot. In reality, they're few and far between, and that kind of builds a case for that you're not going to find a body very easily.
Mm-hmm. What you said then leads me almost to, and it does lead me to another question I had for you, and that is that you point out today there's an increase in people who are receptive to a paranormal interpretation or who are going along that type of theory because of the lack of a body. Let's say we go forward another 50 years. Because when Peter Byrne, for example, wrote The Search for Bigfoot, he said, I think if I get the right funding, I can get one of these things. I can prove it in 3 to 5 years. And obviously he was unable to prove it. In fairness, he mightn't have got all the funding he needed as well. But that was almost 50 years ago now that book was written. If we go forward another 50 years and there's still no actual body, or there's still no skull found, or no really hard and no type of physical proof that would change the paradigm, that the scientific establishment would all of a sudden go, okay, there's a relict hominid population or whatever in America. Do you think the Bigfoot field will go more and more and more to that type of paranormal interpretation? Or do you think there'll still be a very strong physical crowd that are, I guess, out there looking for an actual North American wood ape?
I think, yeah, I mean, there may be more in that camp that believe it's paranormal in some nature, but I think you're always going to have those that believe the total opposite and stick to it. I mean, we're talking about humans, and humans have all sorts of opinions and will stick to them. But again, yeah, if we're after 50 years later, and you can see where Peter Byrne was coming from, there was no thought of this paranormal Bigfoot. It just, people have seen this thing. It was very much seemed logical that okay, it's a flesh and blood thing, and I could capture one or shoot one. I mean, this guy is a big game hunter. This is how he thought. Get further down, you start, well, maybe there's, uh, you know, some other alternatives or explanations. So, but you factor that in with how long it goes to without proof, then more extreme theories are going to come in, because we're still somehow having to explain why people see these, but we don't have proof. It's like, how do we explain that? And that's why I think, yeah, there'll be more extreme theories, but I don't think we're any closer to knowing which one is correct if we don't have the proof.
I know Jason from Sewer Papers just said between Mexico, the US, and Canada are estimated to be over 900,000 black bears. And obviously, you're saying if they are a physical creature, there's probably a heck of a lot less Sasquatch around here than that. I also know Jason's position is that he thinks some of these might be a genuine physical phenomenon, while there are others that seem to be so out there that perhaps they're paranormal. And when you read Texas Bigfoot, you almost get that impression with some of the cases as well. Some of the cases you can look at and think, well, that one could be physical. And then there are cases of like, what is it called? The goat man, the white one, which is flinging tires over the heads of people. And, like it seems to be such an out there story. It's hard to take as physically real. And some that at first mightn't seem to have that big a problem. The geographical location poses a problem, like the one outside of San Antonio in a homeless camp, essentially like it haunts where there's homeless people camping. I'm thinking, how could there be Bigfoot just outside of San Antonio? Like they're the questions that make me think some of this it's almost too hard to imagine how these things can hide in some of these areas and then disappear or travel and not be, not be seen far more often.
Right. I mean, that lady was adamant she saw a Bigfoot at that homeless camp, and you look at the area, and I've been down in that area. I'm like, man, this just hard. This would be hard for a creature like that to pass through without having 50 other sightings. I mean, there would have been other calls, 911 calls. That just you'd be very hard for that creature to get in there and get out. It would be kind of trapped because it's so developed. And yeah, that becomes a problem. It's like, then you just question, well, did the lady actually see a Bigfoot? I mean, we can't even prove that. So, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, well, if we take her at her word, yes, then we have to start saying, well, did it beam in there like Star Trek or what? But, you also got to say, well, this is a report and this is on record, but that doesn't mean that lady wasn't just totally crazy or saw, that saw what she saw. It's part of the history, and it's a crazy situation and a cool story, but we're not sure she even saw one. So that's the conundrum.
Ken Rock, who is one of our regular viewers, said, rumor has it that Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, that they found Bigfoot, but the government has those bodies. It's again a rumor I heard years ago. And you point something similar to that out in Texas Bigfoot. You say a lot of these stories where there might have been evidence, there's these ongoing, I guess, for lack of a better term, rumors, because they're not provable, that the US government or some agency is actively trying to hide the existence of Bigfoot. What do you think about those kind of stories?
Well, I mean, I think the government has at some point paid some attention to this. I mean, we know they've paid attention to the UFO phenomenon, which I think the UFO phenomenon is something would be a higher priority. Just in terms, I mean, obviously in terms of not homeland security, but like literally world security. Bigfoot, less, but certainly at some point, and I suspect in the 70s when Bigfoot was starting, the stories were really starting to come out. I guarantee you the government put somebody to look into this. Now, whether they still do or care, I don't know. And there's always those rumors, and I've heard the one about Mount St. Helens, and certainly if that erupted I mean, animals were fleeing everywhere. And if there's Bigfoot there, they're going to flee too. And yeah, it's possible the government found bodies. I mean, again, we don't have any proof, but it's not a stretch to think that they did. But I don't think that the government's actively like in some campaign or crusade to cover up all the sightings. And if somebody does say I've got a body, the FBI rushes in, swoops in and gets it. You hear these stories where almost every time somebody says they had a body, almost every time they say the government showed up and took it. I don't know, but if I get a Bigfoot body, the government ain't gonna know nothing about it until such time as I've already got photos and everything else. And if they take it, then they, of course, they took all the laptops and stuff. It's like, trust me, I'll have photos that they can't get. And so I don't know. The government's lucky and they confiscated every bit of proof and took it all, and nobody was left with a photo, not even one photo to prove that, look, I had it and they took it. I don't know, but it's just another unsolved mystery.
Yeah. Perhaps as a final question, unless Jen has something else after this, but I always think of you as a journalist and a commentator as much as an actual researcher. So I suspect sometimes you might be able to look at the community a little bit from the outside with that kind of journalistic writing type background. So what do you think that the Bigfoot research community is doing right? And what do you think they could be doing better?
Well, I don't want to be the judge on this necessarily, but I certainly don't. I consider myself an investigative journalist who just happens to be interested in these stories, sort of
Right.
the Indiana Jones who writes books.
Mm-hmm.
I never claimed to be a cryptozoologist or even a Bigfoot researcher. That's just what people, just by default, I guess. So in some cases, yes, I'm looking at the history. I'm looking at it objectively. I understand both sides of skepticism and people who have seen something and I believe them. So I try to look at all this objectively. I think the main thing is, like, I see a lot of griping as to why mainstream science, they won't pay any attention to it. We cannot show them blurry photos with circles and sort of vague stuff. We must present the best of the best, even if that's not being able to present very much. But the more there's just stuff out there that just looks the most unscientific approach, they're just going to become more and more turned off. And they're already turned off. Bigfoot is like on lunch boxes. That science don't care, other than maybe Todd Disotell, who will run some DNA if it's got a credible chain of custody. There are some guys out there that are interested, but they're just as skeptical. They're not going to pretend, and they will only run something if they feel it has merit. But again, anything we present to the world, it needs to be the best of the best. It's okay to share between peers, but I see a lot of just stuff out there that's like, ugh, it doesn't help the Bigfoot community. But I don't know. Does it really matter? I don't think so, because like I said, science don't care anyway. It just matters if someone comes up with, look, here is whatever physical proof, all that lunch boxes are going to be erased. It's like, now it's a actual scientific specimen, and everybody will jump on it, and every scientist will be like, oh yeah, I've always loved this Bigfoot thing. Nonsense, man. Now you're saying that. And then we'll take it from people like us, and it will become something else. But that's okay, fine. And at least, they might say, well, if Bigfoot was real, then what about all these other creatures? Maybe these guys know something. They're onto something. So no worries. But I don't know. And the other thing I would add is, we need to have fun with it. It should be a fun subject with all the arguing. Nobody can prove stuff. Let's just be tolerant of opinions. Just it's cool. You could say it came from outer space. I'm like, I can't say it didn't. I may not agree, but I'm not going to sit here and argue because that's just complete waste of time. It's just a agree to disagree and just say we're having fun investigating this unsolved mystery, and maybe we'll find some proof. And let's go in the woods and enjoy nature, and just have more fun with it, and don't get feathers ruffled. That's my opinion.
I think that's an excellent point. As the great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, once said, I might be wrong and you might be right, but together we can get closer to the truth. And I think that's something that every Fortean field can learn from.
Definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. If you don't share, if you're not willing to share and to kind of meet halfway, you can't progress. I mean, we'd still be in caves if we agree on something that moved us forward. So it has to be kind of dropped. It hurts the ego when somebody doesn't agree with you, but is to move forward with something where it's us against the rest of the world who thinks this is crazy, not us against each other.
Did you have any parting thoughts or questions for Lyle, Jenn?
Well, I totally agree with what he just said. That's for sure. I see a lot of it in the paranormal side of the investigators, the ghost hunters, is how they like to be called, and just constantly a lot of bickering about how somebody investigates or what tools they use, and it's just like, come on.
Right. It's like same. It applies to all paranormal. Categories. And again, arguing like, hey, nobody, unless your method produces actual provable results,
right?
Every method is just as good as the next one, and there's no reason to argue. Just say, oh, that's cool. You do that, I do this. Let's see how that turns out. Cool.
Well, it was such a joy having you back with us on Talking Weird, Lyle.
Yes.
Can you let all of our viewers and listeners know how they can get a hold of Texas Bigfoot, how they can listen to Monster Bizarro, and how they can keep tabs on everything else that you're up to?
Well, best place would be to visit my website at lyleblackburn.com. There's a link there to my online store where you can buy autographed copies of my books, but you can also pick them up on Amazon. You can listen to my podcast, Monstro Bizarro, which comes out every month, and that's on major podcast platforms. Again, there's a link on my website where it'll tell you more about the locations where you can get it. If you would like to see the Small Town Monsters movies, you can view most of those on Amazon Prime. And if you just search Lyle Blackburn on Amazon Prime, the ones will come up that I've been involved in, and you can enjoy those right there in the comfort of your own home. So I appreciate it.
Well, thanks again so much for joining us. It was a great joy to chat as always. And until we have the pleasure of talking to you again, you and all of our viewers and listeners, could you please keep it weird?